All right. Well, we will go ahead and get started here. I'm going to lead us through the kind of liturgy that we've been using to start things off. And then in just a moment, I'm going to hand it over to Kyan, who will be teaching once again this morning. But we're going to be saying these words together from 1 Corinthians 13, the apostles' instructions on kind of what love looks like. And really, I think what this is showing us what the love of Jesus looks like towards us. And so what it looks like to kind of extend that same sort of love towards each other. And so I'm going to say each of these phrases. You can just repeat it back to me. Again, you can keep your microphone muted. I know that it can often create all sorts of lag and echo when we're doing this together via Zoom. And so I'll say these words, you can say them back to me, and then I'll take a minute to pray before we jump in. So let's say love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy or boast. Love is not arrogant or rude. Love does not insist on its own way. Love is not irritable or resentful. Love does not rejoice at wrongdoing. Love rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes all things. Love endures all things. Let's take a minute to pray together. Jesus, we are grateful that you are a God who is actively at work in us and in your world through your Holy Spirit. And so we do pray that even this morning, as we consider what it looks like to be faithful to you, as we consider what it looks like to reflect your image, to reflect your beauty in the world of politics, even places that are very, very broken and full of sin and injustice, we do ask for your help. That you would make us into people who look and love like you. And when we recognize that we cannot do that unless you show up and move in our midst. And so we ask that you would do that even this morning. We love you and pray these things in your name. Amen. Well, at this point, I'm going to hand over kind of teaching responsibility to Kyan. As you probably remember from a couple weeks ago, we did one session kind of focused on criminal justice. We wanted to take a few kind of these class sessions towards the end and focus on kind of contemporary issues and think through how do we kind of approach these things Christianly? How do we think through these things in a way that is wise and attentive to scripture. And so today, Kyan is going to especially address kind of the idea of just war theory and how Christian thought has even influenced how what public policy sometimes looks like in relationship to something as horrific as war. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kyan, and he can kind of set up the rest of the conversation, and we'll go from there.
All right. Thanks, Sam. So thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning. I'm really excited to talk about just war theory this morning with you all. And I think one reason why this topic is especially interesting and exciting is two things. One, this is a real concrete issue. We are no longer in the realm of academic abstraction. Although there might be points in today's class when it might feel like that, we are not. This is very real. What we're going to be talking about today is about under what circumstances is it appropriate, if ever, to intentionally take someone's life, particularly on an aggregate corporate scale. And so these are real practical questions that leaders and citizens, voters, have to consider and have been forced to consider across time and place. So it's very concrete, but also this is an area of thought where even today in the secular West, Christian thought has deeply influenced not just modern philosophers, but also the law of war. And that's something that we'll get to towards the end of today's class that just war theory isn't just something that happens in a classroom, but has affected what nations actually do, the on the ground decisions that are made. So that's what makes this really exciting. That this really matters, and this is a great example, one of the best examples, in my view, of how distinctly Christian political thought has influenced um, areas of thought, philosophers who are themselves not Christian. So I think this is a really good example of some of the themes that we've been talking about throughout the class and how they've been applied to a specific concrete issue. So first of all, I put together a PowerPoint, so I will share that with you all so we can see that. Let me see if I can. There we go. So we're going to start today, before getting into the midst of the material, by breaking out into small groups to talk about a few of these questions. The idea here, also before I proceed, I should note that we're going to break a little bit earlier today, around 9:40, since there are some pre-service activities that some of you all may want to tune into the service stream for. So we're going to break a little bit earlier, so just be aware of that. So I'm going to break us up into small groups and breakout rooms, and let's do 3 breakout rooms. And why don't we all discuss these 3 questions? Just offer your thoughts, first of all. I'm curious what you all think, just to get us started on these are questions that Christians have wrestled with for centuries, and non-Christians, for that matter, have wrestled with for centuries. And beyond that, I'd like you to, beyond these 3 questions, think about some questions that you might have. I hope that we'll have time at the end, before we break, to have you all ask some particular questions that you might have. So we'll open to breakout rooms, and then we'll do that for about 5 minutes and then reconvene. All right. So I think everyone is now back with us. So I hope that was a useful exercise to get your minds thinking about some of the difficult questions here that the existence of war raises. Let's go back. So we'll be staying on this slide for a while. The first thing to realize about just war theory is that the beginnings of the just war tradition predate Christianity. I do think it's interesting to start with Plato. So Plato wrote about war in both the Laws and the Republic. And interestingly, Plato did say that there were certain rules that ought to govern conflict, but he sharply distinguished conflict between Greeks and non-Greeks, which he said was natural. And he said that that's total war. There are no rules that govern that conflict. But war among Greeks was unnatural and was sort of a fundamental problem. And that because it's unnatural, there should be limits on the way that Greeks fight with other Greeks. And so he began sort of this thinking that there have to be limitations on conflict. There ought to be limitations on conflict. But he drew this distinction between Greeks and non-Greeks, which is sort of a lasting distinction, right? It exemplifies the distinction that all of us are inclined to make between ourselves, our group, and the outgroup, others. And so the emergence of Christianity dramatically changes that focus, right? The idea that one of the principal contributions of Christianity to just war theory is the idea that there are some things that we owe to everyone by virtue of the dignity they bear as image bearers of God. So that's Plato. So that's the beginning of the Greco-Roman just war tradition. But the principal figure, certainly the most influential classical figure in the just war tradition, is Cicero. And the key text here is De Officiis on Duties, which he wrote about 5 decades before Christ. And here we get two important precepts of just war thinking that continue to today, and that is just cause and proper authority. So Cicero said, in order for a war to be just, it needs to be waged by a proper authority. And here we get to something that has been a theme throughout the class, which is there seem to be at least some things that states can rightfully do that individuals cannot rightfully do. And the exercise of violence is the paradigmatic example. And so Cicero says only a proper authority can exercise war. So the Roman Empire exercising authority via the Senate or a consul, Cicero would say that those are the only authorities that can properly wage war. Otherwise, you are a rebel and you're acting unlawfully, and therefore per se unjustly, according to Cicero. So the key idea here on proper authority is that only legitimate states can wage war justly, and only the state can wage war justly. So that's the first key piece that continues to be a key piece of just war thinking even today, even following the Christian tradition. And then in addition, and this is the key piece and really the locus of debate for millennia, is just cause. So a war can only be just if it's fought for a just cause. Now, what is a just cause? So Cicero suggested a few just causes. One is in defense. So the idea, and this is something we'll see throughout generations of just war thinkers, that self-defense is a natural right. We all have a very strong intuition that it is appropriate for us to defend ourselves on an individual level. And by analogy, it must be just for a nation to defend itself via violence if necessary. So self-defense, that's one. But Cicero doesn't stop there. He also says to defend property is also an appropriate use of war. And then most controversially, Cicero says, and to take vengeance for prior injustices. So if one nation does something that for example, the Romans thought were unjust, Cicero said, well, the Romans can go to war to punish the nation for the prior injustice. That, of course, is a very elastic cause. And lots of the subsequent debate is about what properly falls into that category. Is that a proper category at all? Can that justify war? So that's the seeds of this tradition in Cicero. And then fast forward about 5 centuries to Augustine. So Augustine's thought on war is contained in a variety of different works, including The City of God. But one of the most important is a fairly obscure work today, which is Questions on the Heptateuch. Heptateuch are the first 7 books of the Bible, Genesis to Judges. And in this work, this commentary on these first 7 books, Augustine writes about the justice of war. And of course, you might guess what is causing Augustine to address this topic. There are lots of wars fought in the Old Testament, and particularly in the first 7 books, particularly in the book of Judges. And Augustine is reflecting on what could make those wars just. And here I want to pause to emphasize that Augustine recognizes the tension here. He doesn't just blow by it. There is especially for Christians, there's a particular difficulty in justifying violence, right? We go back to our discussion a couple weeks ago about criminal justice and the Sermon on the Mount. How do we reconcile the radical injunctions of the Sermon on the Mount when you are wronged, don't wrong in return, but turn the other cheek? How does that ethic of sacrifice and nonviolence, how could that possibly be reconciled with going to war? So Augustine recognizes that. And even prior to Augustine, the early church was deeply conflicted on this question. Two of the early church fathers, Tertullian and Origen, wrote, I won't say extensively, but wrote repeatedly on this issue, particularly with respect to whether Roman soldiers could be Christians, or whether Christians could remain Roman soldiers, or whether they needed to find a new profession. And there was definitely conflict on that question. It was a controversial point of contention in the early church because of this difficulty, how to reconcile intentionally taking another's life with the Christian ethic of love and sacrifice and forswearing of violence. So what does Augustine say? So Augustine incorporates Cicero's two precepts: just cause, just authority. So again, Augustine, and this is interesting, Augustine, you'll recall from way back in the early part of the class, Augustine is suspicious of governments. He recognizes that governments can also often be used for unjust means, and it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish them from bands of robbers. But nevertheless, he says only you have to have just authority, legitimate authority. You can't, non-state actors can't wage war justly. But crucially, Augustine adds a third criterion, which continues to exist today in contemporary just war theory, and that is just intention. And this is perfectly consistent with Augustine's broader ethical approach, which is the thing that allows a soldier to fight justly is if he is fighting with the appropriate intention. So that even his fighting, even taking a life, if it must be done with charity, with the objective has to be to love, not for vengeance, not out of anger, not out of a desire for prideful honor or to acquire land or other property. It has to be out of a desire to see peace and a resolution of the conflict. So that is a key piece, and there's several significant things there. So one, that's important about that. That's an important criterion in deciding whether to go to war. Are we really trying to accomplish something noble, or do we have selfish motives? And Augustine would say, if your motives are selfish, then you can't do it. It's unjust. It's unjust to go to war for selfish motives. But it's also an important limit on our conduct in war. And that's because if you have a proper intention, if your intention is motivated out of love, then you're not going to engage in cruelty. You're not going to engage in disproportionate responses. You're only going to use violence if absolutely necessary. So Augustine, again, is offering this in the context of a commentary on the Old Testament, and it's not a systematic view. So Augustine is deeply influential in subsequent just war theory, but it's not yet systematized in his thought. So moving up again about 700 years, we get to Gratian, who is a deeply underrated thinker, extremely important. And he, however, is not a theologian. He is a canon lawyer. And so this is around this period of time, there's the rediscovery of Roman law. So secular ancient Roman law, in combination with a series of pronouncements issued by popes and Roman Catholic councils over the preceding centuries, and that very jumbled body of legal doctrines and edicts, Gratian combines in a work called the Decretum. And this is what I think is especially interesting, and this is an important theme in today's discussion, is the just war theory is developed both by theologians like Augustine and then later Aquinas, but also by lawyers. And that's what gives it, and it's I think, the influence of lawyers that gives it its crisp, rule-like quality that we'll get to in a second. So Gratian helps systematize things, and we have a nice, in this quote here, a nice capsule summary of what makes a war just. Gratian says, "A just war is that which is waged from an edict," which means that is from a lawful authority, and in which injuries are avenged. So that's the just cause piece. And shortly after Gratian, we get Aquinas, who further refines this idea. And he adds in his Summa Theologica that even in a just war, only necessary violence is licit. So this is where we get the beginnings of the necessity criterion. And so this is, even if you might have a just cause to go to war, your nation has been wronged by some other nation. If the dispute can be resolved short of war, war is unjust. So there's this necessity piece. And crucially, that necessity piece applies not only to the decision to go to war, but also the individual actions taken in war. So any exercise of violence can only be justly undertaken as a last resort. So it's a further limitation on the propriety of taking life. After Aquinas, a few hundred years later, we get a follower of Aquinas, another Dominican named Francisco de Vitoria. He is part of a sequence of very important scholars in Catholic Spain called the School of Salamanca. And he wrote a book in 1532 called De Jure Belli, so on the justice of war. And here we get a very, very important idea that's become very influential today, which is that soldiers could fight justly, even if they are unsure the cause for which they are fighting is just. And it's important to see why this is so crucial. So if we go back to the very beginning, everyone agrees, Cicero onwards, that a war is just only if it's fought for a just cause. And if you take a moment to think about it, you realize, well, that means that in many wars, both sides are fighting unjustly because neither of them have a good reason to fight. But in the best case scenario, only one side is just. It's impossible for both sides to have a just cause to fight. How could that possibly happen? Once you have that, then it begins to be difficult to understand how soldiers on both sides could be fighting justly, right? Because by definition, at least one side is unjust, and then that starts to raise difficult questions about why they should treat each other with the same limitations on violence, the necessity and proportionality limitations, right? And then we get back to the beginning of the problem. If everyone thinks that they are on the side of angels, that can justify disproportionate responses, breaking the rules, if you will. So Vittoria adds, this is sort of the solution, his solution to that problem, which is we live in a really complicated world. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether a war will be just. Not merely the ethical uncertainty as to what causes could justify war. That is a serious source of uncertainty. But there's also a factual uncertainty. What happened in the deep past? One side says this was our land and you took it, and so we are justly retaking it. It could be unclear whether or not that's actually true, just as a purely historical matter. And so Vittoria says, if you're a soldier fighting in the war, you can fight justly, even if you're not really sure whether it actually is objectively a just war. And that helps justify the equal treatment of both sides. So that's Vittoria. And then finally, we have a very important Protestant thinker, Hugo Grotius, who is a Dutch Protestant who writes about 100 years later, and in many ways is transmitting the ideas of Vittoria and the Spanish scholastics to the Protestant world. And his book, De Jure Belliae Pacis, which is on the law or on the justice of war and peace. And here, Grotius develops a very systematic perspective, a set of rules about how to decide when war is just and unjust. And he lists a long series of potentially just causes for war. So this is the long history, and that takes us to modern just war theory. So I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'll try to speed through this. But the important thing here is modern just war theory, and you may have picked up on this while we're going through the history, distinguishes two concepts. One is jus ad bellum. Those are the rules for starting war, the deciding whether to go to war in the first place. And then rules for jus in bello, so conduct in war. And modern thinkers have sort of boiled these down, these requirements, largely in inspiration from the thinkers that we just discussed, to 4 rules for starting war. So you have to have a just cause, legitimate authority, it has to be necessary, and it has to be proportional. So it's not just, you don't have any other choice, but if it's a relatively minor injury that you're trying to redress, war may be a disproportionate response. And also baked into the proportionality is efficacy. So if going to war is going to be fruitless, then imposing the inevitable destruction that goes along with war may be unjust, because if you're not going to accomplish anything, all of that unnecessary destruction, it's unjust to just create all of that unnecessary destruction without any offsetting benefit. And then rules for jus in bello, conduct in war. This is where much of the contemporary debate resides. The key idea there, and this is something we talked about earlier, is discrimination. So between combatants and non-combatants. The idea here is it is licit to kill combatants. There are lots of reasons hypothesized for why that might be. But the idea is it's licit to kill combatants, and it is either never or almost never permissible to intentionally kill non-combatants. Here, lots of examples, even in modern history, World War II, lots of examples of governments intentionally killing non-combatants for the purpose of shocking their adversaries into submission to lower their morale. And modern just war theory says that's impermissible. You can't do that. It may be permissible to take an action where the non-combatants may be in danger, or even if you know with certainty that the non-combatants will die. But what you can't do is intentionally kill non-combatants for the sake of killing non-combatants. That's an essential distinction in modern just war theory. And before we close, I just want to underscore, as a lawyer, I know that all of this can sound very abstract, and I think there's a natural inclination a lot of folks have that this kind of fine-grained philosophical parsing just can't be applied in the chaotic context of war. But the fact is, the international law of war, which is embodied in part in the Geneva Conventions, has real significance. There are lawyers that are embedded in American military units that help the commanders decide whether or not to take particular actions. The lawyer might say, look, there's the collateral damage is just too great, and so taking this action is going to be disproportionate and therefore unlawful, and we can't do it. And that's something that happens. That's not a hypothetical. That's something that happens. And so it's important to see that and I think it's a great success. I mean, this is a great example of how Christian thinking has actually influenced, makes real difference to what governments do today, even secular governments, entirely secular governments, not just the United States, but other governments too. So that is a whirlwind tour of just war theory. So I'll stop the sharing there. So does anyone have any questions before we wrap up? We can take one or two questions if anybody has any.
Well, sir, I have just a comment. Certainly the advent of nuclear war, which basically takes out, parts of continents, raises grand challenges to just war, some of those aspects of it. And so I guess in one sense, I'm glad we got it first, but in counter to that, carpet bombing is no different, just smaller scale, but it still wipes out grand swaths of a country. So these are more they're noticed in the absence as opposed to in application.
And one resource that I highly commend to all of you, I'll make sure that Sam includes it in what we circulate later today. One of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, a Catholic philosopher named Elizabeth Anscombe, G.E.M. Anscombe, wrote a fabulous essay, very short essay, called On Mr. Truman's Degree, which is an argument about why Harry Truman acted unjustly in dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's worth seriously considering. I won't disclose to you all what I think about that, but it's a very powerful piece, and it's a really wonderful and interesting application of some of the principles that we've been talking about to a very real and very difficult historical example. So, and I think we may have gotten oh yes. So we have a question in the chat. Are we saying that just war theory was influenced by Christian thinkers, so then it is biblical, or as close to biblical we can get without clear biblical black and white statements? So I think the best way to think about this is just war thinking is, particularly in the classical tradition, Augustine and Aquinas, is the product of Christian thinkers' attempt to understand the entire scriptural testimony to this issue. So on the one hand, you have the gospel account of violence and how Christians should react to violence, but you also have God commanding the Israelites to go to war in some circumstances. And so how to understand all of the different, so that the scripture does not lay out all of these different rules, certainly. But just war theory is an attempt to understand and provide practical guidance to policymakers and voters what scripture says about the problem of violence and war. And so I think that's the best way to understand it. So it's not simply that just war theory is in is an addendum to the 10 Commandments or something like that. It's not. And it's certainly contestable. There is a long and respectable line of Christian thinking that's thoroughly pacifist, that says that that Christians can't engage in war at all. As I mentioned before, it's possible to read the early church fathers, Tertullian and Origen, as taking that position. But interestingly, Elizabeth Anscombe, and this is why I find her essay so powerful, she is not a pacifist. So she thinks that it's a mistake to be a pacifist, because if you're a pacifist, then it's very easy to transition from pacifism to the idea that war is a no-holds-barred, morality-free zone. And Elizabeth Anscombe and other just war thinkers say, no, sometimes war is permissible, but it's still part of our ordinary moral framework, and we have to, there are limits, just like there are limits to anything else we do. So I hope that was helpful and stimulating. And we'll be sending out some resources in case anybody is interested in exploring this issue further. So I will let you all jump onto the sermon live stream, and thanks for joining us.